On the night of September 5, 2022, Prince Mongol Malang slid behind the wheel of his gray Golf 8 GTI with a woman at his side, unaware that his final moments were following close behind. For years, he had ruled South Africa's underworld like a ghost, feared and untouchable. But that night, a white VW Polo shadowed his every move, carrying men with a single mission: to bring down the reign of the country's most feared heist boss. What happened next was swift, merciless, and more brutal than anything Malang could have imagined. This is the story of how South Africa's biggest heist king met his end. In the streets of South Africa's townships, the name Mongol carried a weight that was hard to ignore. To some, he was a feared crime boss whose empire was built on intimidation and violence. To others, he was just another product of a broken system that promised equality after apartheid, but delivered very little for those at the bottom. His real name was Enko Sivumile Prince Malang, born on March 24, 1979, in the townships north of Pretoria. But his story did not unfold in the same way as another Malang, who shared not just the surname but also the soil of Pretoria. Just weeks after Prince was born, Solomon Kalushi Malang was taken out by the apartheid regime. Solomon, only 22, had chosen to fight against oppression as part of the ANC's armed wing. His passing turned him into a martyr of freedom, his name forever etched into South Africa's struggle for liberation. When he faced the hangman's noose, his last words promised that his sacrifice would nourish the tree of freedom. And indeed, it did. His legacy became a rallying cry. Prince Malang, however, would take a path that was the exact opposite. While Solomon's life was lost in the fight for justice, princes would one day be claimed on the unforgiving streets in a war for criminal power. Their lives mirrored South Africa's two realities: one of sacrifice for a better future, and one of survival in a country where that promised better future never arrived for everyone. Prince grew up in Soshanguve, a township that itself was a creation of apartheid's cruel social engineering. The very name Soshanguve came from combining the first syllables of different ethnic groups: Sotho, Shangaan, Nguni, Venda, people who were forcibly moved there under the Group Areas Act. It was meant to be a dumping ground for black South Africans who had been stripped of land, opportunity, and dignity. By the time Prince was growing up in the 1980s and early 1990s, the system of apartheid was already wobbling, but the scars it had left were deep. Life in Soshanguve was not one of opportunity, but of struggle. Families lived in poverty, schools were underfunded, and danger was never far away. For a child, the township was a place where survival came before dreams. Hunger was common, frustration was constant, and crime was often the only path to wealth that seemed realistic. Psychologists and social researchers have long pointed out how children raised in such environments are far more likely to fall into cycles of crime, and Prince was no exception. As he grew older, the world around him pushed him further into the streets. Crews in places like Soshanguve thrived precisely because the formal system offered young men almost nothing. Education led to dead ends, jobs were scarce, and frustration with inequality was everywhere. In that void, the crews offered something the state did not: identity, power, brotherhood, and money. Prince became what South Africans called a tsotsi. The word was more than just slang for a street enforcer. A tsotsi was someone street, smart, ruthless, and bold enough to carve out survival through crime. He had the look, the reputation, and the willingness to use force when necessary. He rose as someone who understood both the hunger of the streets and the fear that came with it. As Prince Malang grew older, the hunger for power and wealth pushed him far beyond the petty crimes of his youth. He was not content with scraps from the streets. He wanted an empire, something that would cement his name as one of the most feared men in South Africa's criminal underworld. And he found his market on four wheels. While others chased smaller opportunities, Malang set his sights on bakkies, the beloved pickup trucks that dominate South African roads. Toyota Hiluxes, Ford Rangers, and Isuzu D-Max. These vehicles were everywhere, but more importantly, they were worth a fortune once they were taken. The demand for them stretched far beyond South Africa's borders. Syndicates in neighboring countries like Mozambique and Eswatini paid top dollar for bakkies, either stripped down for parts or smuggled whole to feed a thriving black market. For a man like Malang, this was not just crime, it was business, and he treated it with the same precision and planning as any legitimate enterprise. His syndicate was not a ragtag crew of reckless street thugs. It operated with chilling efficiency. Teams of spotters scanned the streets, identifying targets. Surveillance was tight, escape routes carefully mapped, and every move calculated. When the time came, hijackers moved in with military-like precision, often armed and merciless, leaving terrified drivers stranded while their backies disappeared in seconds. Technology was their silent. Signal jammers cut off vehicle trackers before police or recovery teams could react. The taken vehicles were then moved to hidden workshops, where they were either stripped down or given new lives. False documents were drawn up, fake chassis numbers stamped in place, and suddenly a hijacked backie could reappear across the border with a completely clean identity. At the center of all this was Mongol. His fingerprints may not have been on every hijacking, but his influence ran through the entire operation. He was the one who kept the supply chain moving, ensuring that backies never stopped flowing into the black market. He was the man who turned car theft into a million-rand industry. And with that fortune came the image he wanted the world to see. Mongol was never shy about flaunting his success. In the townships, he became a symbol of what money and power could buy when the law meant nothing. Videos of him spread across social media, dancing at parties in designer clothes, his feet wrapped in expensive sneakers, his body draped in the latest fashion. His cars were status symbols, none more so than the Golf 8 GTI he drove proudly through the streets. For young men in Soshanguve and beyond, his life was a living advertisement for the criminal shortcut. The message was clear: forget the grind of poverty. This was the fast track to glory. But this constant show of wealth was not only about enjoyment, it was strategic. Every flashy outfit, every viral video, every public appearance was a performance of power. It told his rivals that he was untouchable, that he had money, protection, and influence that no one could break. It also tightened his grip on the younger recruits who idolized him, drawing them deeper into his world where loyalty was rewarded with cash, cars, and a piece of the power he radiated. By the time Mongol had cemented his grip on the streets, his reputation was no longer just about stolen cars and smuggling networks. It was about something darker, something that gave him an aura of untouchable danger. Cash-in-transit heists. That was the real prize. That was how Malang would etch his name into South Africa's criminal history forever. Prince Mongol Malang didn't just rob armored cash vans, he turned heists into something closer to a military operation. His robberies weren't reckless smash-and-grab jobs. They were perfectly planned ambushes that left security companies terrified and the police always one step behind. One story in particular spread like wildfire. People said that in early 2022, Mongol himself had pulled the trigger and taken the life of a G4S security guard during a cash-in-transit job. For those who lived in fear of him, this story confirmed what many already believed. He was not just a car thief, not just a man who ran a lucrative network. He was someone willing to cross the line into without hesitation. In the underworld, that kind of reputation was priceless. It struck fear into rivals. It made potential traitors think twice. And it wrapped his name in the kind of deadly mystique that elevated him from an ordinary gangster into a living myth. Whether true or not, the story hardened his image, and it became part of the legend that followed him everywhere. But the official version of events told another story. On February 25, 2022, a G4S guard did lose his life outside the Manandi Spar in Centurion during a violent cash-in-transit heist. The Hawks, South Africa's top crime-fighting unit, immediately took on the investigation. Within weeks, they had suspects in custody. None of them were Mongol. The first to fall was a young man named Sabelo Lawrence Masamola, just 27 at the time, arrested on March 7. A month later, his relative, Elias Masamola, only 24 years old, was tracked down and charged. Nearly a year later, another man, 41-year-old Godfrey Kanyana, was tied to the crime after detectives linked him to the getaway car, a white Toyota Corolla. He had tried to throw the Hawks off his trail by filing a false hijacking report, but that cover story collapsed under pressure, and soon he faced charges not only of perjury, but of taking a life and armed robbery. Throughout this entire process, one name was never mentioned in any official statement or police report: Prince Mongol Malang. On paper at least, he had nothing to do with the G4S guard's death. The men in court were different, and the evidence against them was concrete. Yet out on the streets, people were convinced that Mongol had been behind it all. That gap between fact and belief was telling. In the criminal world, perception can be far more powerful than reality. It did not matter whether Mongol actually pulled the trigger or even if he was involved at all. What mattered was that people believed it. That belief gave him an edge, a cloak of fear that no amount of police paperwork could erase. If rivals thought he was capable of firing on a man in cold blood, they would hesitate before crossing him. If the community thought he was that dangerous, it only deepened his legend. Some say Mongol encouraged these rumors, feeding the myth deliberately because he knew what it brought him. Others argue that his name had grown so notorious that any act of violence in Pretoria and its surroundings would be automatically linked to him, whether he was there or not. Either way, the result was the same. His reputation grew larger than his actual record, and that reputation, true or false, carried its own risks. It painted him as a man too dangerous to live freely forever. However, the very legend that kept him on top would also drag him toward the downfall that was waiting for him. He had spent years building his empire on fear, blood, and stolen fortune. But history has always been unkind to men like him. No matter how untouchable they seem, no throne in the underworld is built to last. For Mongol, the walls were already closing in long before the night that sealed his fate. It was Saturday, September 3rd, 2022, in Pretoria's Sunnyside, a neighborhood that usually pulsed with life but fell into uneasy silence after midnight. The streets were calm, but calm in his world was always a mask, hiding dangers that never slept. At 43, Mongol was still carrying himself like the underworld boss everyone feared, a man equally known for his sharp clothes and his relentless ways. That night, he slid behind the wheel of his pride and joy, a sleek, gray Volkswagen Golf 8 GTI, its polished body glinting faintly under the streetlights. Beside him sat a woman, described in some accounts as his wife, relaxed and unaware that this would be the last ride of his life. As the GTI purred its way through the streets, approaching an intersection not far from Loftus Versfeld Stadium, the trap was already in motion. Out of the darkness, a white Volkswagen Polo crept into view, quiet at first, then suddenly alive with fire. In an instant, the silence was shattered. A storm of bullets erupted, tearing through the night with merciless precision. Rounds ripped into the GTI's steel and glass, the sound echoing against the buildings as if the city itself was bearing witness. The strike was not clumsy or frantic. It was cold and methodical, the kind of move carried out by men who had studied their target and knew exactly how to finish him. Mongol never had a chance. The hail of bullets struck him down in the driver's seat, ending him before he could react. This was no random hijacking, no desperate robbery. It was a planned hit, executed with military precision. The message could not have been clearer. His attackers wanted the world to know that the untouchable underworld boss had been reached at last. By sparing the woman at his side, they made the statement even louder. This was personal, this was deliberate, and this was final. For years, Mongol had ruled by myth, feeding off the fear of being seen as a man capable of anything. But when the bullets found him that night, the myth crumbled into reality. His end was not just the fall of a man, but the tearing down of an image that had intimidated Pretoria's streets. And just like that, the man who once strutted through Soshanguve as its #1 street figure was left lifeless in the car he had loved so much. His elimination sent shockwaves through Soshanguve, and though the case remains unsolved, few people believed it was random. In the unforgiving world he moved in, often came from across the table. Rivals saw his empire as both a prize and a threat, and by taking him out, they cleared the way to grab the millions that flowed through his hands. The throne of an underworld boss is never left empty, and within days of his end, whispers filled the township about who would rise next, setting off another round of power struggles. But before the dust could settle, Malang's send-off became the talk of the entire nation. On Friday, September 9th, 2022, his funeral was held at his home in Block H, Soshanguve, and it was nothing short of a final show of force. The cost alone, said to be more than 300 rands, turned the ceremony into a spectacle that felt more like a coronation than a burial. The rules for attendance showed just how much image meant to him, even in only brand new 2022 model cars were allowed in the procession, and mourners were expected to dress like royalty. Covered in designer clothes that gleamed under the Pretoria Sunday, it was as if Malang had orchestrated the event himself, making sure that the world remembered the power, wealth, and influence he had built from the shadows. The police presence was heavy, not out of respect, but because the air was thick with unease. Officers lined the streets, watching closely, prepared for trouble to erupt at any moment. The underworld had gathered in one place, and funerals of men like Malang often became the spark for fresh conflicts. Yet despite the flashing lights and sirens, the day unfolded as one of grim celebration, a portrait of a man whose story could not be told without both fear and admiration. Inside the funeral program, however, a softer side of Malang was revealed. one that very few people outside his family ever got to see. Family members like Jafta and Fani Malang spoke of him not as the feared underworld boss, but as a man of love, laughter, and responsibility. His wife, then Jiwi, and the children added emotional tributes that pierced through the image of power and painted him instead as a father who was deeply cherished. Letters from his children stood out the most, raw with emotion and heartbreak. One of them, signing off as Lashy, promised never to stop loving him, writing, "Rest easy, King Prince." Another, Momodi, remembered him as a hero, thanking him for being both a loyal husband and an even greater father. To the world, he was a relentless figure who commanded fear. But to them, he was the man who tucked them in at night, who shielded them from the dangers he himself created, and who left behind a void no fortune or crew could ever fill. Malang's enemies were not content with just bringing down an underworld boss. They wanted his name buried with him, his empire stripped apart, his memory reduced to nothing but whispers of fear. His elimination was only the beginning of a cold and calculated mission, to dismantle the empire he had built brick by brick, and to make sure that no one who carried his torch would last long enough to keep it burning. For a short while after the funeral, his men tried to act like everything was still intact. On the surface, the machine kept moving. The cash still flowed, the cars still rolled, the meetings still happened, and at the center of this fragile continuation was Vizi Zoro Singalela Mangiti, Malang's loyal right-hand man. At 45, Zoro had been there through it all. He was not just a bodyguard or an enforcer. He was the shadow that knew every deal, every hideout, every cop on the payroll, and every rival that Malang had crushed along the way. If there was anyone who could steady the ship, it was him. But Zoro was not just stepping into a role. He was stepping into a target zone. The men who had brought down Malang had not finished what they started. They were watching him closely, circling like predators, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came in February 2023. It was an ordinary morning in Mamelodi East, the kind that gives no warning of danger. Zoro walked out of his home, climbed into his bakkie, and pulled off with the calm confidence of someone who had survived the darkest corners of South Africa's underworld for decades. Maybe his mind was on business, maybe on family, maybe on the deals waiting to be closed. What it was not on was fear. Behind him, a white BMW began to follow. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but as Zoro turned down street after street, the BMW never drifted away. Then, in an instant, the quiet morning was shattered. Automatic rifles barked from behind as bursts ripped through the backie's rear window, tearing into metal and glass with deafening force. Zoro's instincts took control. His foot slammed the accelerator into the floor. The bakkie surged forward, weaving across lanes, running lights, and swerving past unsuspecting cars. But no matter how fast or how recklessly he drove, the BMW was glued to him. It was unrelenting. More rounds pounded into the vehicle, each one dragging him closer to the inevitable. On Marishane Street, his luck finally broke. The bakkie, torn to pieces, began coughing and faltering under the relentless hail of fire. Smoke and sparks sputtered as it slowed to a crawl. Zoro knew he was seconds from being boxed in, so he made a final, desperate choice. He flung open the door and leapt out, sprinting into the street, hoping his legs could carry him where his car could not. But the BMW swung around and cut him off. The started again, and this time there was no escape. Bursts tore through his body until he collapsed, the street stained by the fall of a man who once carried Malang's empire on his shoulders. By the time the police arrived, the attackers had already vanished, leaving behind nothing but evidence of their precision. 29 spent cartridges glittered on the pavement. A stray round was lodged deep in a wall nearby, and in the middle of it all lay the body of Zoro, no longer the shadow of an empire, now just another casualty of the purge. Word tore through Mamelodi faster than the shots that ended him. First Malang, now Zoro. This was not a coincidence. This was not random street trouble. This was a message written in a systematic takedown designed to erase South Africa's most feared heist crew from the top down until not even its memory could inspire loyalty or fear again.